Professor Horn is one of those who's sort of worked to actually not so much to bring other histories into military history, but to really try and make military history much more a part of mainstream teaching, to bring it into the study of all other fields of history as well. I'll reserve the rest of my comments for after the lecture, so I think we can begin.
So thank you very much indeed for the invitation. Well, as everybody will be aware, we are at the midpoint in marking the centenary of World War I, 2 years after the initial commemorations in 2014, but with a lot of important dates still ahead of us, not least, of course, 2017, 100 years on from the United States' entry into the war, and the Russian Revolution. So the end of 2016, halfway through, seems a good moment to me to pause for reflection. And Delhi and the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library are both of them for me, a particularly appropriate place in which to pause and reflect on the commemorations of the First World War halfway through the cycle. Not only was the building, I'm informed, which is right next to the library, the Teen Murti Bhavan, originally known as Flagstaff House, a British military headquarters, but of course the memorial outside the gate, which is reproduced on the poster for this lecture, commemorates the contribution to the imperial war effort by 3 princely states, Jodhpur, Hyderabad, and Mysore. And India poses better, it seems to me, than almost anywhere the question of what the Great War meant, and therefore what it might mean today, for the former colonial world. The former colonial world of Britain and France, that's to say, in countries which had not yet achieved national liberation or nation-state status. Now, this will be a theme running through my talk of the relationship between memory and commemoration and the nation-state, and therefore what we do with memories and events which precede the formation of the nation-state. Now, all this is another way of saying that one of the issues raised by the centenary, and I think genuinely it's perhaps the most interesting thing which has come out of the centenary of the Great War, is the issue of how we try to write global histories of a world war. I mean, it was a world war, like the Second World War, so logically the question is how we try to write a global history, or global histories in the plural, of such a war. Now, as a historian of France, I'm more familiar with the case of Algeria. But as an Anglo-Australian who lives and works in Ireland, India has always been part of my imaginary world. Well, 2 questions run through what I want to say today. The first is, what does it mean to commemorate the past? And the second question is, how does commemoration relate to historical understanding of the past? Commemoration, it seems to me, in its essence, by its nature, speaks to the present. Anniversaries are the moments when we remember our links with the past, and also when we draw lessons from the past. It might be a 10th anniversary, a 50th anniversary, a 100th anniversary, a 500th anniversary. But these are the moments when we think, well, what did that event in the past mean? What does it mean for us now in the present? And it seems to me that commemoration is essentially that relationship. And if we didn't do this, if we didn't try to draw lessons from the past, our public lives and our politics would be much poorer. They would be cut off from one of their primary sources of meaning. I'd even go further and say that if we didn't extract meaning from the past, if we didn't have a memory of the past, if we didn't commemorate it in some fashion, it will be almost as if we were individual human beings trying to function without a memory. And we know that that's not possible. And therefore I think it's also true of societies, states, and nations, that they have that collective memory. And therefore commemoration is one of the ways in which, in the present, they draw on the past. But of course, that poses the question of what the lessons ought to be that we draw from the past. And when we commemorate something, when we say, well, now we're going to commemorate the, whatever it might be, the 70th anniversary of Indian independence, the 100th anniversary of the Great War, fine, but what are the lessons that we actually draw from the past? And is it possible when we commemorate to avoid banality, to avoid simply commemorating the thing that we could all agree not to disagree on, what I would call the lowest common denominator in commemoration? And it's here that my second question comes in, which is the role of history. Because history and commemoration, it seems to me, are different activities. They share the past as a subject, but history seeks to deepen understanding by reopening old questions, constantly reopening old questions, and also asking new questions. The present in which we live has its own evolving relationship with the past, and if commemoration selects the messages of the past for the present, history is constantly interrogating the past for its own sake. And it means, therefore, that at heart, at root, I think they're radically different activities. In commemorating, we're drawing things that are useful from the past for the present. History, the historian goes in, and we can all of us be historians, not just professional historians, we say, what's new about the past? What didn't we know about the past? What can the past tell us that we weren't aware of? And there often is, I think, a kind of sharp clash between particularly what politicians may wish to commemorate and what historians argue was really the important thing about the past. The key point, I think, to grasp, if you asked me how do I sum up what was involved in the First World War, is that World War I confirmed the nation-state as the chief form of political organization and the main source of political identity in the contemporary world, especially in Europe, but not just in Europe. In other words, the First World War is the moment when the nation-state becomes the organizing principle of politics and the key source of political identity in Europe. Now, of course, it's true that 100 years ago, Europe had already experienced the ferment of national feeling for over a century, since the French Revolution. Yet it is the case that three multinational empires still ruled the eastern half of the continent: Habsburg, Austria-Hungary, Romanov Russia, the Russian Empire, and of course the Ottoman Empire. So we have three dynastic multinational empires which still dominate the eastern part of the continent. And all of them saw themselves in 1914 as being menaced by nationalism and national identities. So one explanation of the outbreak of World War I is that the issue of how these dynastic empires might deal with the nationality principle had created a regional conflict between Austria-Hungary, a dynastic empire, and Serbia, an emergent nation-state, and that upset the European balance of power. And so that regional conflict between a dynastic empire and an emerging nation-state triggers the conflict between the two alliances, armed alliances, between which Europe was divided. Nationality, in that view, was the trigger for the First World War. But the Europe that emerged from the violence of World War I 4.5 years later was, as it still is, a Europe of nation-states, and that's something that Brexit has just forcibly reminded us of, the importance of the nation-state to contemporary Europe. The new states in the East were locked in conflict over the shattered remains of the dynastic empires that they had replaced. Austria-Hungary, gone. Russian Empire, gone. Ottoman Empire, gone. And a conflict between nation-states which are emerging in that space which some historians have called the shatter zones of Eastern Europe and into the Caucasus. And although and those conflicts, of course, between the emerging nation states, I would argue, prolonged the First World War until 1923. That we shouldn't think of the First World War as ending in 1918. It didn't. It transmuted into a different set of conflicts which don't really begin to ebb out until to fade away until 1923, 1924. And although with World War I the French and the British empires reached their zenith, their height, as they absorbed Germany's colonies and they carved up the Ottoman Middle East, The war also saw the first stirrings of the spirit of national independence in many parts of the colonial empires. In 1919, as Europeans gathered in Paris under Woodrow Wilson's leadership to remake their world on the basis of national sovereignty and democratic self-determination, colonial intellectuals demanded the extension of these same principles to the empires, in vain, as we know. Now, national sovereignty, of course, only swept the colonial world after World War II with decolonization. But World War I marked an important step in the emergence of the nation state, I think, not just in Europe, but on the world stage as well. And I don't need to remind anybody here that in India, the Montagu-Chelmsford reform proposals, however timid they were one aspect of that change, just as Mahatma Gandhi's transformed attitude to political resistance and the British reaction with the Amritsar massacre were other manifestations of that same emerging tension around the nationality principle in the colonial world as well. But the drama of World War I was by no means limited to the nationality principle, far from it, because the price paid by all the parties in the conflict was terrible. And even the victors, even Britain and France, showed very little triumphalism in 1918. The cost had simply been too enormous. And this was due to the nature of the military conflict and the sacrifice of the soldiers. World War I think, was a tragedy in this sense that none of the decision makers in 1914 understood what war itself meant. Nobody had seen it coming, that kind of war. Envisaging war as a rational instrument of policy, imagining war still in the light of the Napoleonic Wars 100 years earlier as a matter of movement and decisive battles, endowing the idea of war with heroism and martial masculinity, most Europeans in 1914 thought that war, however awful it might be, would be short, it would produce a rapid result, and it would basically leave their world unchanged. It would be an instrument, a political instrument, for readjusting things, but it would not transform the very nature of their world. Digging trenches, therefore, was a logical response to this new reality. It was a form of self-defense, but it turned the war from one of movement into one of siege. Now, of course, siege warfare is as old as war itself. But traditionally, if you think of a siege, one side defends a strong point, a town, while the other side attacks it. But in this new kind of siege warfare, which was extensive in open country, each side besieged the other. Each side was attacking and defending. And because this was, in Europe, coalition warfare, it didn't occur just in the West, but it occurred in the West, in the East, in the South, on the Austro-Italian frontier, at Gallipoli, and then in Macedonia. We could, in fact, say that Europe was a continent under mutual siege around its inner perimeter, each side attacking, each side defending. Europe experienced mutual siege, I would argue, during the First World War, and each side was both Trojan and Greek. The societies, of course, searched constantly for solutions by endless renewed offensives, but offensives which were supported by developments, industrial combat, artillery as a means of attack, air power, tanks, chemical weapons. These are all inventions of the First World War. But somehow they never managed to find the wooden horse for their modern Trojan War. The balance of advantage gradually swung back to the offensive, but only decisively so with the German Blitzkrieg in 1939 to 1941 in the following war. In 1918, the Allied victory, such as it was due as much to attrition, to wearing down the enemy's total resources on and off the battlefield, as it was to new tactics. But victor or vanquished, the price was more than 10 million military dead. As early as August 1914, and then with increasing intensity, aircraft were used not just for military needs, but to terrorize civilians in an effort to break their morale by bombing them. Aviation was in its infancy, and the means for doing this were very limited. But what I'm suggesting is that for contemporaries, already in their minds, the idea of Dresden in 1945 was clearly there. The British War Cabinet in 1917 saw no problem with directly bombing German civilians with the intention of breaking their morale. The ultimate challenge of such a war was the mobilization of the popular will. Political authority, the capacity for sacrifice, psychological resilience, these were the deep resources of the nations and the empires involved. And it was on these as much as on the military that their fate turned. As it happened, the dynastic empires proved less able to sustain this challenge. Austria-Hungary, Tsarist Russia, and Ottoman Turkey crumbled from within beneath the incredible pressure of this need for total mobilization. Nation-states proved more resilient, but even liberal democracies, Britain and France, which together with Italy and the United States formed the alliance opposing the Central Powers once the Bolsheviks had taken Russia out of the war in 1917, even they had to remobilize themselves for what Clemenceau called the last quarter of an hour. What Clemenceau meant by that was, he said, in this terrible all-out struggle, the society which could believe that it was going to win for 15 minutes longer than the enemy was the one which would win. In other words, he was saying the political and the psychological resources were ultimately vital. And this effort, therefore, helped radicalize Europe in the last 2 years of the war, and even more during the conflicts of this greater war that extended down to 1923. So let me turn now to the question of memory and commemoration, and this kind of paradox in a way. The memory of the Great War is strongest in the Western Allied nations, and above all, Britain and France. This is also true of the former settler dominions, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, because I think that those settler dominions formed their nationhood at Gallipoli and at the Somme and the battles in France. Of course, as everywhere, World War II eclipsed the First World War, but since in Europe, World War II was mainly an Eastern Front war, the French and the British military dead remain higher for the First World War than for the Second World War. They're still the most lethal wars in British and French history, the First World War. Let me just briefly cite the Polish case, because I think it illustrates a wider issue, which also relates to much of the then colonial world, including India, which is, as I mentioned at the outset, how you frame in national memory the experience of a war that preceded the creation of the nation state. Poland, as you know, had been divided since the end of the 18th century between Germany, Austria, and Russia. And 3.5 million Poles were enrolled by conscription in the armies of those three powers in 1914, with those in the Russian army fighting against their fellow Poles in the German and the Austrian armies. Some 400,000 Polish soldiers died. Independent Poland resulted directly from World War I. But the new Polish state derived its foundation myth from the wars of 1919-1920, when it fought for its new frontiers against Lithuania and Ukraine before it defeated the Red Army at the gates of Warsaw. Now, these national memories, or their absence, have played a key role in the centenary commemorations of World War I since 2014. Each of the ceremonies held in Europe in the summer of 2014 was organized by a nation, although with other nations invited. The European Union was almost totally absent from the commemorations. And so too were the Russians, a major power in 1914, but who simply weren't invited, let alone the Serbs, because the Serb memory of the Great War, and Serbia suffered almost more than any other country in the Great War, is now tarnished by the behavior of Serbia and Bosnian Serbs in particular during the wars in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And no one commemorated the Habsburg War in 2014 in either Austria or in Hungary. This then brings me to my second question. If I've been talking so far, after discussing the nature of the war, talking about commemoration and how national commemorative frameworks have dominated, now the question is, well, so what can the historians do, the contemporary historians, to try to inject some kind of a note of dissonance, some kind of challenge to address the transnational in the way that contemporary societies think about the war? In other words, how does doing history relate to commemoration? And I want to, my question here then is, so if we had a good dialogue between the historians and societies as they commemorate, how might we commemorate the war? There are three perspectives that I want to focus on in this last part of what I have to say. three perspectives that I think have been opened up by historians since the 75th anniversary of the war. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, that particular anniversary, the 75th anniversary, which was 1989, passed completely unnoticed. The world had much more important things on its mind: the fall of communism, the end of the Berlin Wall, the bicentenary of the French Revolution in historical terms, perhaps. Yet this was also one of those years, 1989, when time shifts on its axis, when the relationship of the present to the past switches quite dramatically. And I think that that was so in how we relate to the First World War. Because 1989 closed a period of contemporary history, what historians and societies more generally had come to call contemporary history, that opened in 1945. So in other words, our present time, the world in which we live in 1989, begins in 1945 with the end of the Second World War as a global event. But suddenly, with 1989, that was closed. Contemporary history was now closed, and a different time frame opened up. This was, of course, famously formulated by Eric Hobsbawm in his book *The Age of Extremes*, 1914 to 1991, in which he argued that there was a short 20th century. The real beginning, in fact, had been 1914, and it went to 1989, which meant that 1945 was now no longer the beginning of contemporary history, but it was just a kind of a way station in the progress of this short, or regress of this short 20th century. Unlike in the late 18th century, when revolution in America and in France changed everything, including war, it was now war that played that role. It was war that changed everything, including revolution. We can't imagine the Russian or the Chinese revolutions without the First World War. It shaped their very form. Perhaps this is where this first historian's perspective since 1989 lands us up. Perhaps war was the real revolution in the first half of the 20th century. And the war, the First World War, unleashed far more than it could solve. We have to get out of our minds the idea of a 1919 peace conference, which somehow neatly repackages this new world which has come out of the First World War. It doesn't. The peace conference in 1919 is actually the height of the war. It's the summit of the war. And it's only in the second half of the 1920s we begin to get the beginnings of the peace process in Europe. In that sense, therefore, the war unleashed far more than it could solve, and it created future forms of violence, these genealogies of violence. That's the first perspective. The second perspective, to emerge from the reflections of historians and the work of historians since 1989, is that of the soldiers. World War I was not the first industrial war. That sad distinction belongs to the American Civil War, but it did initiate the world into an era of mass destruction. And my final perspective, and here I think the reverse is the case, I think we're closer to understanding here than with the soldiers, is civilian victims. Following events in the former Yugoslavia and the genocide in Rwanda, and with the kind of new awareness of universal human rights as enshrined in law, which I think was a real gain of the 1990s, of the end of the Cold War, civilians and civilian deaths in the First World War, which had long been hidden from view, came into a sharp focus, almost for the first time. Now, I'm not talking here about civilians on the home front, women, workers, and so on, who'd always enjoyed some kind of visibility in national history. Rather, I mean civilians who were targeted by military and state violence, often during occupation as a consequence of xenophobia. These victims did not figure in the national memory framework because often they were elsewhere. They were in occupied territories, or they were on the margins as ethnic minorities. They've proved one of the most active fields of research since 1989, but they've remained almost totally outside the national centenary commemorations. The Western bias and military emphasis in relation to World War I, both at the time but also today, made this episode doubly marginal because the victims were civilian and it occurred on the edge of the conflict. But there's a very important intellectual exercise which I think we need to perform if we're to truly try to write global histories of the First World War, and it's what I would call reverse logic. We might be able to accept the proposition, that Ottoman Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, played a less important role in the First World War than the British Empire. It was weaker, it wasn't present on the Western Front, which in the end was the decisive front. Okay, the Ottoman Empire was less important to the First World War than the British Empire. The reverse proposition is absolutely not true. The reverse proposition is false. The Great War was not less important to the Ottoman Empire than it was to the British Empire. On the contrary, the Great War was more important to the Ottoman Empire because it destroyed it, it created modern Turkey, and it also produced a genocide along the way. And one can operate that kind of reverse logic, I think, with very useful effect in a series of other domains. But simply to limit oneself to the genocide, it was in the Ottoman Empire, under the radical nationalist Young Turk government, that the political and psychological mobilization that I referred to earlier as being the ultimate resource in waging this kind of war, this kind of total war, was turned most completely against domestic minorities who were considered to be the enemy within, who were targeted, who were scapegoated, and in this case, who were eliminated physically, over 1 million of them, with the intention of destroying them as a people. Contemporary observers, such as Britain's Lord Bryce, were not fooled. They knew they were witnessing something which was on a different kind of scale. The extermination of a people is how Bryce referred to it, as over 1 million Armenians were killed or died in deportation. Perspectives opened up by historians on World War I in the last 25 years underline the fact that history and commemoration are not the same thing. Still, there's no reason why, in order to escape the commemorative banality that I mentioned at the outset, the risk that we simply commemorate the thing that we can all agree on and ignore the things that we might disagree on, in order to try to escape that, I think we might be able to incorporate some of these new historical perspectives into whatever messages we choose to formulate from the present. But the obstacle to doing this is the discrepancy between national memory frameworks. Fortunately, the encounter between history and commemoration consists of more than state occasions. It entails rich possibilities in the public sphere. Much of what's happened, certainly in the West, has been not government ceremonies, but the arts, museums, the media, education programs, and there I think there is a much richer possibility for an interaction between commemoration and history. I'm not saying that the reverse logic I applied a moment ago to the case of Turkey would work the same everywhere, but it does seem to me a good tool in order to dethrone a Western and a Western Front vision that risks falsifying our understanding of the war. It's in such transnational thinking and in exchanges of the sort that you've been kind enough to invite me to engage in here today that I think we can renegotiate our relationship with a seminal episode and perhaps attempt what might seem blindingly obvious, but which in practice is very hard, namely to write a global history of World War I. And if we choose to do this, to attempt to write a global or multiple global histories, then I think we have a lot to discover and indeed to commemorate in the years of the centenary and beyond.